Good afternoon, Trojans. I'm Erica Maldonado Singh, Associate Director of USC Dornsife Alumni Relations. Thank you for joining us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion early or want to watch or listen again, it will be on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. And a link to the video will be on the Dornsife Dialogues section of our website. Make sure to follow USC Dornsife on all social channels. Our handle is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the Interim Dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Mo El-Naggar.
Hello, and welcome to our first Dornsife Dialogue of 2025. Of course, the year did not begin like we imagined here in LA. My thoughts go out to our alumni and friends who were affected by the devastating fires. And I'd like to thank so many of you for the tremendous outpouring of support you've provided to both our Dornsife and extended communities. The Trojan family, as expected, has been out in full force during these difficult times. Today, we kick off our spring semester dialogues with one of our own, Danzy Senna, USC Dornsife Professor of English and one of the most celebrated voices in contemporary fiction. Her latest novel, Colored Television, has been hailed as the new great American novel by the Los Angeles Times and was named one of the best books of 2024 by the New York Times and the Washington Post. Danzy's work is not only well received, it adds a unique and important voice to conversations about complex issues related to identity and culture. She dives into the complexities of mixed-race identity, artistic ambition, and the relentless search for authenticity in a world that can often feel deluding, filtered, and absurd. Her storytelling is fearless and deeply human, proof of the ability of literature to help us see ourselves more clearly. Joining her is Jonathan Escoffery, an acclaimed author whose debut story collection, If I Survive You, exploded onto the scene with its own share of praise. As someone who sat in Danzy's classroom, Jonathan brings a unique perspective to this conversation, and maybe even some stories about what it's like to learn from someone who has been a leading voice in the literary world for years. So I'll hand it over to Jonathan to get us started, and thank you all for tuning in.
Good afternoon to our audience. Thank you for joining us today. I want to remind everyone who's watching from home or elsewhere that you can submit your questions to the chat, and Danzy and I will do our best to get to them towards the end of the hour. And now I want to welcome Danzy. I'm so happy to be speaking to you today about your beautiful novel. You know, this is a book that hits that beautiful sweet spot between page turner while also engaging with social critique and exploring what it means to survive as an artist, both spiritually and materially. And I couldn't thank you enough for writing this. It's a book that I needed and read at the right time that I needed it. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. It's so fun to talk to you again, because I had such a great time reading your pages in my workshop when you were in graduate school. And of course, you were a graduate student, but you very quickly became a colleague. Like, it was sort of imminent that your book was coming out. So it felt like we quickly got to see your work enter the world, and it was sort of so electrifying in the workshop, and then to see the world get to read it. And I'm rereading it now, and If I Survive You is just an amazing book. So I'm thrilled to be here with you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I've been toggling between, how do you jump into a book that you love so much? Obviously, you will have talked about it from various perspectives. And I think I want to start here, which is to say, we meet your protagonist, Jane, as she's struggling to complete her second novel, which she's still working on nearly a decade after the release of her debut novel, and which her husband, Lenny, calls The Mulatto War and Peace. It's a sprawling book, that is standing kind of in opposition to the advice that her literary agent has given her to, quote, just bang it out and get it over with.
Right.
And I wondered if you could talk to us about this idea about second novels and, the, I guess, idea of the sophomore curse, but also, the reality of what it's like to approach a first novel and then a second novel and then those books that come afterwards.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that there's all writers face that issue of if your book does really well or if it does poorly as a debut novel, there's nothing to compare it to. So the second novel is sort of the birth of comparison. It's like being a second child, which I also am. I'm very interested in being the second of something. And and so I was trying to kind of play with that anxiety that is general to all writers, but I think is also more complicated by questions of race and representation, and that I specifically faced when I published my first novel, Caucasia. I'd never published anything before. It did better than I could have dreamed. I was in my 20s and I was not prepared for that. But one of the things that was the book and the first novel, and I was thinking about this reading your novel, If I Survive You, is, it's kind of the book that you always had to write. It's the book your whole life has been leading up to your first book. And it brings in all of the sort of autobiographical and the obsessions, but it's very clear to you in a way what the material is. Um, and the second novel is, I think, where you become a writer in a way. It's where you're born as whether you're going to stick this out or not, this life as a writer, which is a lot rockier and more sort of difficult than that first novel maybe prepares you for. And so I was trying to take a novelist and do what the advice she gives her students, which is to make it worse, because my second novel took me 5 years and I was like, let me add on another 5 years and see what I could do with someone who has no tenure, who's still struggling in a sense in the same way she was in her late 20s, but now she's in her 40s and she has children and the stakes are a lot higher.
Hmm. I have to tell you that I'm reading, or I've read this book, and I'm coming to you today from the position of somebody who is working on his second
I
book.
was going to say, is this hitting you different? Yeah.
So, in addition to being, such an insightful, book for me to read, a book that's just so full of life and humor, it also struck me as this kind of horror novel because, it was reflecting back to me a lot of the anxieties that I also am dealing with as somebody who's working on that second book.
Yeah.
And I've definitely heard about this kind of sophomore curse that you could either, try to beat or just work your way through. And as the agent said, just kind of get on with it, bang it out, and work towards that third book. But I've received the advice recently that if you kind of fail at this second novel, then people might suspect that book one was that well received. Assuming the first book was a well received book in the first place,
Oh,
that they
you become
may
a
have been
one-hit
duped.
wonder.
Right?
Child
Yeah. But
star.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But if you really nail the first two books, then you've kind of proven yourself in a way to your readership, so that you can do all kinds of things after that, and you've built this kind of core audience. I don't know if you have any thoughts on
I do have
on
thoughts
that.
on that. I really do, because my first book was a bestseller and did really well, and my second book was trashed. It was mostly ignored, but when it wasn't ignored, it was like hated. And it was in such an extreme measure, the difference between the reception of my first and second book. And I remember reading the reviews of Symptomatic, my second book, which I did a risky thing of writing a horror thriller about race in a moment when nobody was doing that genre mixing of race and horror, and people were completely bewildered by the tone and the material being sort of as dark and comic as it was. And those two qualities that have actually been much more what my work has been since then. But at that time, it was not well received. And, I remember reading the terrible reviews of Symptomatic and feeling this odd relief because I realized that the first novel's excessive praise had made me think that that's why I was writing. And once I
Mm.
saw people hate my work, and this says something about me, I thought, oh, I'm really a writer because I just keep wanting to write now. I am not made by the praise of the world. I'm writing because it's a compulsion. It's what I've always wanted to do, and it's what I'm going to continue to do. And, I think Spike Lee says, by hook or by crook, a body of work. And the real thing is to just have that resilience as an artist and keep writing the books, blind faith in the process of writing, because, I've written now 6 books, and each of them has been received very differently and, by different people. But I keep that as kind of a mantra that I'm trying to create a body of work that eventually that the number of books you write and the sort of commitment to the practice of writing is what will help you survive this, not the those first 2 books.
Mm.
So
I really love that. Yeah, this makes me think. Well, anyway, I have other thoughts, but this actually leads really well into my next question, which is that colored television explores this tension between artists' desire to remain faithful to their artistic visions and that pressure of seeking commercial success. And add to that the decisions that Black artists in particular have to make around explicitly or how explicitly race features in our work, and
yes,
how we do or don't anticipate how audiences respond to however we go about including or not including race in our work. And
yes,
I
yes.
want to kind of pick your brain about this phenomena, and I guess to narrow it a little bit, although you can speak as broadly as you like. Do you see this working differently across mediums? We have Lenny in the book, who is an abstract painter, and chooses one way to go in terms of not including Black representations in any explicit way. We have our the main character in the book, Jane, whose projects are heavily influenced by her identity and her interest in race. And then we have these other characters, like Brett, who's a successful screenwriter. And I'm just wondering how you're seeing some of those choices that various
Yeah.
kinds of artists have to make.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think that's the thing that writers of color really distinctly and consciously have to think about in a way that I think white artists have not historically had to even think about. Like, it hasn't been a whisper of a thought historically, like, can I write another book from a white point of view? Will that be seen as limiting me if I write another white main protagonist? Am I going to be seen as being obsessed with whiteness if I write too many white books? Like, the things, if you flip them, that you realize how much of that sort of extra workload we take on, and that extra kind of weight of representation that we take on every time we put pen to paper. And one of my sort of survival techniques, and I keep going back to the word survive. It's not just to plug your book, Jonathan, but I find myself saying survive. To survive as a writer of a kind of marginalized identity is to kick all of those voices, if I can, out of that sort of sacred writing space and try first and foremost to amuse myself. It sounds very lighthearted, but it's actually not. Like, to keep my own attention and to write the book I want to read, I have to be the first reader. And then it's either the gatekeepers are going to love it, they're going to want it, or they're not. But as to sit with a project for years on end, if you're writing for committee, it's not going to work because you spend so many hours with these characters and these worlds, and it's such a, sort of physically grueling and mentally grueling thing to work with a novel. So I really write to the people in my life and to myself who I don't have to translate for, who are not sort of in that capitalist system and marketplace. And then I just, at some point, I start thinking, oh, I have this draft. Let's see what they think of it. But it's been, really the only way to finish a book for me is to kick that level of pressure out of the room, because it just doesn't help me to complete the thing, which is really the hardest part about writing beyond everything else, is to fulfill whatever vision you have.
Let's
I
talk
think
about
I just was going to say, I think with being mixed race too, it's been very specific that those other pressures that, if you're Black or read as Black, if you're Latino, if you're all sorts of other identities, you get certain specific pressures put on you. And as a mixed race writer, I was facing the sort of strange yawning chasm of no writing from that point of view when I first wrote Caucasia. And the last sort of explicitly biracial Black white characters were tragic mulattoes. And so I was writing into this kind of empty space of trying to write contemporary worlds of biracial people. And that faced its own bewilderment from the publishing industry and from audiences.
yeah. Well, thinking about your main character, her racial identity, um, she's the daughter of a white parent and a Black parent, and that's not just I kind of want to say central to the novel and how she's moving through the world, but also central. I mean, well, I should say it informs her various writing projects, which we get to spend some time with as we're reading the novel. I've heard you talk about the word biracial and multiracial as meaningless, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here,
Yeah.
but and you've also talked about the usefulness of the word mulatto, which is used all throughout the book. I wondered if you would mind or wouldn't mind elaborating on that kind of distinction and its relevance in contemporary discussions about race.
Yeah, it's funny because, I've done a lot of talking about this book, and the first time someone asked me about the use of the word mulatto, I was actually surprised that it had jarred people so much, because my world is so, my sort of inside world is so heavily populated by, quote, mulattoes, and we use the word constantly that I forgot that other people weren't allowed to say it. And there you go to like how I'm writing to the most sort of intimate group of people. I'm writing to the people in my world who constantly speak with a level of irony and use these terms with, like, we're in a safe space and we can use these inside terms that I wasn't sort of trying to argue that everyone should adopt the word mulatto. It was more me writing to how these characters would speak to one another. And and yet, as you're pointing out, I point out in the book, and I've said before, like, the word biracial, I never know what someone is talking about when they say they're biracial. And it's sort of a catch-all term for anyone whose parents identified as members of a different race. And my background growing up with a father who identified as Black American and is a descendant of American slaves, and my mother who comes from, white American background and is a descendant of slave owners, I feel like that identity is so central to me, but also the history that it comes out of. And that is the term mulatto, which is the only word that speaks and comes out of that specific history. Actually, the word mulatto is born of that original sin in American history.
Yeah, no, I've heard other authors, like I'm thinking of Matt Johnson, who's written a bunch of books, including Loving Day. Um, I guess advocate for a more open use of such a term? It sounds like you are not advocating for that, but I
I don't
wondered
want
if
anyone to
you,
get beaten up or something like,
right.
you know.
But would you advocate for a more specific word than biracial? Do you think that would move the needle forward in terms of?
There's nothing prescriptive for me in my writing. I'm not arguing for anything, and that's a very important stance for me to take as a writer of fiction. I remember when Jesse Jackson like declared that we should call ourselves African American. Like that's his job. My job is to write fiction and to write fully formed, worlds and characters and situations that raise all these questions. But I think sometimes as writers of color, especially Black writers, we get asked to be Obama, to wear these other hats that, I sort of want to live in a much freer space than that. And where I'm not sort of, and maybe it's an irresponsible space, but I want to kind of really claim the fiction writer artist loophole or caveat that like nothing I'm writing should be seen as prescriptive, and certainly not Jane's behavior or anything that she does. It's a world I'm describing and it's descriptive, not prescriptive.
Well, you bring up Jane's behavior, so let's talk a little bit about that. She's, in a position where, it might be first useful to the audience members who have not read the book yet that um, as it's described, her and her family are living on borrowed time because they are living in her grad school friends. And this is Brett, the successful screenwriter. They're living in his home. Brett's away on set in Australia, but he's due to come back. At some point, and that clock is ticking, and that's very kind of present. We feel it. It's part of what's so suspenseful about the book. And as that pressure increases, Jane starts to make some really interesting choices that are, they're interesting, they're questionable, maybe morally, ethically. Um, that must have been so fun for you. I kept thinking, this is such a great character. This is so fun to spend time with Jane, even as my eyebrow is going up as she's making,
Right.
choice after choice. Can you talk
Yeah.
to us a little bit about what that was like
Yeah. I think you were in my auto fiction class, right? We did that class about sort of thinking about the sort of shadow self that you write as a fiction writer, and it's like you, but it's doing things differently than you might either want to be seen doing, or that choices that you might not make, but take away a few of the sort of safeties in your life, and you might have made those choices. So for me, writing characters who get into trouble and get messy and do things that aren't quite protecting them from trouble. Like you don't want to protect your characters from trouble. Nobody wants to read about upstanding, happy characters. At one point, I think I said to a class, it may have been yours, like, we'd rather an alcoholic than a pothead. We want someone who acts out, not someone who goes inside their head. And so for me, it's really important to see the characters acting out and creating trouble. And Jane really does that. And you have to be able to sort of identify with why they're doing that and see the reasons. And for Jane, she and her husband have lived in this kind of bohemian squalor for many, many years. And now they have two young children, and she's in her 40s, and whatever kind of romance to living in this starving artist, bread and roses life of and also being nomads is beginning to kind of fade. And so I fully identified with her reasons for doing things that were not on the up and up, in a kind of desperate quest to enter the middle class, which is very hard to do for artists. And I wanted to kind of fully believe her desperation. So I had to build things into their life that made you understand them, even if you didn't approve of them.
Yeah. And it's such a potent image of Lenny and Jane emptying the wine fridge and
I love the way the fact that they drink all of their subletter friends' wine is always the most disturbing thing to people, which I find very funny. I'm like, she does a lot of other bad stuff, but the drinking all of his vintage wine bottles is somehow, just it's kind of marking the time and the sense of doom
yes,
that she's drinking herself into a very bad situation when he comes
yes,
home.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, she's
yeah.
not a good friend.
Right, not not a good house sitter. That's for
Oh, don't rent your house to her.
right, right. No, I love that the time marker, the visual. I mean, it's to me clearly not the worst thing she does, but it is such a trackable
Yes.
image throughout the novel, and I absolutely love that. Um, to back out a moment for again those fortunate and unfortunate people who have yet to read the novel. They're fortunate because now they get to go read the novel and have the joy that I've experienced a couple times over now. But could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind colored television and the book, maybe what led you to the title itself?
Yeah. Well, I'd been living in LA for many, many years when I started this novel, and I'd always really wanted to write like a really LA novel because I often write about New York and Boston, and LA has crept into my stories, but I wanted to write something that was like that LA was a character in this. And I've loved so much of the literature of Los Angeles, and you know, also have lived in the shadow of the television and film industry, as all of us novelists do. And I would go to parties and sort of feel my irrelevance in LA when I would say I was a novelist, and people would say, "Oh, has any of your work been made into anything?" And feeling that the novel, itself, when you live in LA long enough, starts to feel like intellectual property for an adaptation rather than the goal in and of itself. And the way that the city can work on your sort of worries about your obsolescence. And all of that was very much in my mind as kind of a theme and a situation I wanted to dig deep into. And I had done a little writing for television at that time and it felt like this like sparkly sort of this high actually because the potential for getting rich and for having your work sort of experienced on such a large scale felt so huge and alluring. And publishing felt like this like frumpy last century thing that I'd been doing. And I tapped into that feeling that I was having. And it was like at the height of prestige television. And that feeling I had that books were sort of fading into the history and television was taking over. And to put this novelist in this space and see and poke her and see what I could do with her in that situation felt really rich.
Mhm. You early in the book, there's a quote I want to read from the early paragraphs, even describing LA. Um, it reads, "Every story about the apocalypse was really about Los Angeles," and this is coming from the narrator, but this is told in a close third person point of view, and every story about the apocalypse was really about Los Angeles. Was there is there anything you could I'm really interested in that, and then I'm interested in how that read after the last few weeks
Yeah.
that's been going
Well,
on.
I
Yeah.
had also been thinking about those first few months of the quarantine and the COVID pandemic and friends of mine from New York calling me and me having this sense that like LA does apocalypse really well. Like we had been writing this story in films for many, many, many decades about like what if this thing goes wrong? What if this pandemic takes over the world? And now we were just sort of we were on the set of the movie we had been writing. And it feels like LA has such an interesting dichotomy where it's both like the land where dreams come true. It's this kind of sparkly never land of beautiful people and sunsets. And then it's also, you know, this incredibly kind of dark space of like end of the world calamity. And during, you know, the fires, I was thinking, here we are again, like LA will revive, it'll reinvent itself. And, you know, people on the East Coast maybe didn't quite understand that like LA is does apocalypse well. Like this is where we shine, that we are like a place that like constantly has these things happen and then kind of has to reinvent itself. And it's kind of part of the identity of the city.
Absolutely. I'm sure that there are some academics who are viewing this. There are some grad students who are probably tuning into this. Probably people who are thinking about, you know, given the nature of the creative writing, the dual program, creative writing and literature, how one balances a creative life if they are intending to stay in academia, work in academia, break into academia in the way that
Yeah.
actually pays the bills.
Right. And that is a big question in the book as well. It's like, how do you make a living as an artist? And I think we need to kind of talk about that more in these programs and really talk about like what the financial reality is of being a novelist or being a visual artist, and how do you survive those things? Because it isn't, you know, a consistent job. You don't have the Writers Guild, you don't have these sort of support systems built in it. The one support system you do have is teaching. And I've over the years, you know, had to really change my writing practice. The more I had children and I had students and a job to go to, and it hasn't made me less productive. It's just meant that I've had to sort of be flexible in terms of when I work. I don't have the thing where I'm working every semester from 9 to 5, and I'm saving a lot of it for the summer or for those semesters off. But I think you just constantly have to like look at your lifestyle and do a check-in. Is the old way of working continuing to serve me in this new chapter? And I think of life as sort of chapters, and now I'm in the chapter where I'm teaching and raising children, and the writing has had to adjust to that. Because most of us aren't trust fund babies and aren't like living in an inherited property without any responsibilities. Like most of us have to make another source of income, and the university has really been, you know, this amazing, I wouldn't say benefactor, but supporter of artists, because we often, you know, need something to kind of stay alive while we make our art, and that has been, you know, such a gift for me, is having this job.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other upsides to the steady teaching gig apart from knowing where your health insurance comes from? And
I think, I mean, I love having younger people in my life and being able to kind of stay, I think, mentally limber and culturally connected in a way that I've seen people who don't have a kind of connection to the university who are artists. And I think you can float off into the stratosphere a little bit, and it keeps me very much connected to the world in sort of multiple generations, which I really like. And I also, you know, like to teach the things that I'm thinking about in my own work so that it becomes generative rather than purely taking from me. But it's something that, you know, when we were doing our autofiction class with you, you know, that was something I was trying to puzzle out, was like, what was my relationship to all of these protagonists? And I got to think about it with a group of really smart people. So I've really made friends. I'm not like Jane. Jane rags on teaching the whole the whole book. Um, but I was having fun with that with Jane. But for me, it's been like, I feel very lucky to have a steady job. And as someone who grew up without parents who were not tenured and who were struggling, like I see the gift of it, of being in a steady place. The writing doesn't come from, desperation and terror. Yeah.
Right, right. I
You
love
know.
that. We kind of started off talking about the first novel, the first or the trajectory through the second novel, that kind of important, the things you learn about yourself through the reviews and through getting it done, and resiliency and all of that. I wonder for those people at home who are a little bit earlier in the process of getting started, if you have any tips for, how does one find, and this is actually coming from an audience question, so I'm not pulling this from my own curiosity as much as I know there are people who want to know where do you start, where do you start this journey as a fiction writer, and maybe that's for someone who's been dabbling, who's been journaling for a while, but they want to start taking things a little bit more seriously. Can you reach back to that person? And
Yeah. I mean, I was a journalist before I was a fiction writer in terms of my job and public life. And I was working for a magazine in New York. And I was scared to make that leap to writing fiction because it felt so risky and, hard to break into. And this is where, I do really believe in workshops, as, hokey as that may sound, but I took night classes at the New School in New York and um, just started the process of learning to put my work in front of other people and to get their criticisms of it and start to learn to edit my own work and to realize that first drafts are should be bad, should be flawed, and that kind of get into the process, and to start thinking like a writer and not just like a reader, where you're reading works and you're starting to think about where you pulled into this story, where you pushed out, and starting to look under the hood and think, how does this work? How does this person pull me in? And then to understand craft, in a sense. So I think that's how I began, was actually through night classes and starting to just put my toe in the water to think of myself as a writer.
you'd mentioned having to remain nimble across the various teaching schedules and maintaining your writing practice. Is there any particular thing that has remained consistent that might look like a writing routine, even if it means times are shifting or the places you write may have changed? Is there any constant?
I think I learned this actually with my second novel when I had a job, because most of my books I've had jobs, in fact, every one of them, but I had a really sort of intense work schedule for my second book, and I was working like, 60 hours a week and at a magazine. And I learned at that point that I work better for my first draft in a public space, not at home. And so I started to go to a cafe in Brooklyn every day for 2 hours and work on the first draft. And I had rules for myself that I had to write forward in scene, and that I had a car that was at a meter, and I had to stop after 2 hours and go to work. And I realized that having sort of limitations around my work is where it becomes most free in a kind of paradoxical way, and where I actually produce the most is when I have these kinds of, and where I'm not in my house and I'm not next to my refrigerator and I'm not dealing with my dogs or the laundry, but I'm actually like sitting in a space that's just for the writing of these scenes and just moving the story forward. And editing can take place in a lot of places, but that's where the first draft happens for me. And libraries, cafes.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with with a lot of what you're saying, and especially the having the hard stop on your kind of writing session. I Right before I came to USC, I was managing a writing retreat where I had negotiated that my writing time would come before 1 p.m. And I knew every single day at 1 p.m. calamity was going to strike
Yeah.
because all of the residents at this writing retreat were going to come knocking on the door. And our 90-year-old, the owner of the retreat, lived on site as well. And, for him, a lot of things that weren't really emergencies would would seem like emergencies, such as a resident left window open when it was below 60 degrees out, and this was a case for emergency. So
Right.
that hard stop really, I mean, my fingers would start moving faster, my brain would start moving faster. I would really generate such, um, important material in the session in that last hour or even that last 10 minutes. I think
Yeah.
that's such an important point.
Yes, it's strange but true. It's not about being wild and undisciplined and unstructured that you create the most
Mhm.
interesting work. It's through these structures and discipline and daily practice that it happens.
Absolutely. We're getting some great questions from the audience, so I want to check in with those. One of those is, and I'm just going to read it. In the book, Lenny has this fantasy of moving to Japan, mirroring some of the other Black artists who have had success abroad. Is the impulse to escape or take a break from America something most artists working with race experience?
Hmm. I mean, I think that's historically been very true. And the sort of fantasy that, especially with the Harlem Renaissance through James Baldwin and Richard Wright, like this is a large part of the Black American artistic imagination and the theme in the work of trying to be freed from this place in which, we're always living at this sort of level of double consciousness. And I have many friends and people who I love. My own sister moved out of the country and never came back. And I would say race was a huge part of that. But I was interested in both Lenny's desire for that and the tension with Jane, who does not desire that. And my own experience of living abroad, and this was the sort of mulatto idea comes from as well, that my identity makes no sense in any other country but this. And I have a line, I think, in my memoir, which is about my parents' histories, that this is my only homeland. Like other people have other homelands to look to, and to think about Italy or Nigeria or all of these other places. And for me, like the story begins here and ends here. So I was trying to play with that with both her and Lenny and their kind of friction in their marriage about whether to look outside of America or to become sort of entrenched in the problem of America.
I love that section. I'm going to read it real quick because I love it so much. This is Jane. In her decidedly unscientific sampling, all the Black people who left the country in their desperate quest to escape the American obsession with race only became more obsessed with race themselves, or rather became obsessed with not being obsessed with race. And it goes on. There's I'll stop there for time's sake, but it's such a wonderful passage about this kind of inescapability, especially for the artist who may want, to be able to make the decision about how much or little they engage with questions of race, but you know it's very circular. They find themselves right back there, examining, how or how they can't escape it. Uh, for lack of better phrasing. Jumping back to the questions
Yeah,
from the
no,
audience.
it's really a great way.
Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
this, there's guy, Anatole Breard, who is this famous book editor who passed as white his whole life and wanted to become sort of a writer who was not known for being Black, and he was very light-skinned, and he passed for white. And then after he died, all of his Black heritage came out. And it was like the only thing that anyone knows him for now is that he passed for white. And it was sort of like a version of the story you're telling, of like, the more you try to escape something, the more it defines you. Yeah.
Back on our questions, what do you think are the components of a book or a story that are compelling enough to make it into a movie? Does it take away from what the author is sharing?
Yeah, I thought a lot about adaptation and I mean, with Jane, of course, I won't give away the story, but I just hope that the writer gets paid for their work and does get compensated for what they write. But I think of adaptation as a very exciting thing, actually, and that it can really bring audiences back to the book when it's done, if it's done well and done with sort of in good faith. And as long as we see the book and the movie or the TV show as sort of separate things, and that one is a kind of interpretation of that by a different medium, they're not, I don't think they're in competition so much as maybe they used to be. I think there's a really interesting relationship between the two, and I find it kind of exciting to work in both mediums, which I have been doing. And I find that they both kind of bring something to the other the more I work in both of those areas.
Yeah. It even makes me think of, this guy with one book, even experiencing the production of the audiobook to some extent. I had to, at some point let go a little bit. I received the
Totally.
clips and the audition tapes of who
I
was
don't
going to.
listen to them. I don't listen to them.
Yeah,
Because it
it's
is an
expensive enough.
interpretation of your work, the audible version of it. And it's not you anymore. And it's not like how someone reads a line is maybe not how you imagined the person speaking. So it's that feeling like you have to let go of some of that control, is really, I think, a good thing to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I mean, so, my book is technically, we got tricky with it because we didn't put a subtitle on the front in terms of dictating whether people read it
Right.
as a novel or stories. But even I would say as a short story writer, becoming comfortable with the idea that a magazine version of your story can look quite different from the story that winds up in your collection, because cuts maybe had to come as a result of the page count limits that the
Yeah.
literary journal has, and for all sorts of reasons. So becoming comfortable with multiple versions or multiple interpretations of your work, I think, is important to not drive you crazy.
Well, I think that, also gets to, what I would say to you as a younger artist in the process of writing a second book is, by my age, you realize you have finite resources in your brain, and you're trying to protect the next book. And the more kind of mired in the last book that you have to really, protect that last book, but the next book is the one that's in the incubator, and you really have to decide, like, where am I going to give my energy? Like, is this worth my fight, or is this going to take away from my whole morning of writing, which is really precious, and nobody's going to make you write a book. So you have to protect that energy. The world isn't screaming for another book. It's really got to be the thing you decide to protect in a kind of blind faith. And part of that is not getting too focused on the smaller battles that
Right.
are behind you already, in a sense.
Well
Yeah.
said. One of the questions from the audience is, how do us writers keep finding new things to say?
Well, the one thing you can not teach is having something to say. I can teach a lot about craft and plot and dialogue and story, and I can ask the right questions. But, really, that is like at that point, it's about whether you do have something you want to say, and I think it's really a compulsion, and it's a human compulsion. When you look at those cave drawings, you think, okay, the first, cave people were trying to represent something that was their autofiction, right? They're writing these pictures of something happening on a cave wall, and that impulse has to be in you, and you have to have that temperament, and you have to, in a sense, one of the strange things about the older I get and the more books I write, the shorter the distance between something happening to me and me turning it into material is.
That's
Like,
really interesting.
I'm having an experience and I'm already thinking of the me as a she, and I'm thinking of the person who I'm having this experience with as a character, and it's probably not psychologically a good thing, but it's happening and I'm going with it. So you have to have that impulse to kind of turn the world as you see it into a fictional creation, and that's the thing no one can give you. It has to come from you.
Yeah. You said maybe not good psychologically, but has that been good in terms of moving that from experience to fiction or art or any kind of writing that you put out into the world?
I mean,
Is that a smooth, you get it and you now turn it out into
I know, I feel like it just sounds so cold and ruthless, but
no.
that is also a part of being a writer, is to be a bit ruthless, and to feel that the art has a value in and of itself, and that, it's going to cost a lot, but it has to be worth it in the end. And so your devotion to this art form kind of takes precedent over a lot of other things. And there's no way to say that's good or bad. It just is. What it is to be an artist.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I've wondered about my own experiences that I know, I mean, I could get a lot out of, but I've sometimes wondered if I needed to step away from the experience. But sometimes when I do that, I kind of lose the juice in that experience. So that's why I'm so, interested in what you're saying right now.
Yeah,
Maybe I
no,
should actually just go ahead and write it.
I mean, I think it's worth it. And in a sense, you sort of, it's like that therapy line, like finding the narrative you can live with, and then step away from. So writing things and turning them into a narrative that's mine and I'm controlling, there may be something therapeutic in that act of fictionalizing one's own life. I think the jury's still out on that.
Well, we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So, from the chat, Jasmine would like to know uh, how your practice of writing has influenced your personal pedagogy, um, or, more generally, what is your teaching philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with students and undergrads, there's overlap, but it's also different. And I think, when I'm in a room of graduate students, they're adults, they've been working at this for a while, and in our PhD program, I'm often feeling like I'm there to protect that artist self, that may be, having to do all these other jobs of writing theory and papers and analysis. And I'm here to say, like, I'm going to help you generate this work and to protect it. And in the program, I think that's been, a role I feel like I've had to take on. And with undergrads, like, it's the first do no harm. They're trying out this voice, and you don't want to be that person that fills them with fear or shame in that very vulnerable thing of putting their work forward for the first time. And so, I try to do a lot of prompts and play in that space so that it feels generative again and not prohibitive or frightening. And the longer I've taught, the more I've found these tools, the sort of tool bag that I feel creates that safe space to try out these voices for the first time.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Across a couple decades of either leading workshops or more importantly, being in workshops, or, leading workshops on the second half of that, but being in workshops where some professors seem to believe that it's their job to shut down the writer who could do other things in the world. Because if along the lines of, if I can break your spirit, then you're not meant to be a writer, this is obviously kind of terrible, but I have kind of seen that, and obviously I know as your former student that this is very far from your approach, but it is interesting that once upon a time that seemed to be a pretty acceptable way to go about weeding out who is supposedly the real writer and who's just
Yeah.
taking the seat.
No, I've read about those Gordon Lish workshops,
Yeah.
the famous Gordon Lish workshops, and how those just sounded like that kind of, walking around with a whip or something like, let's hear what you've got. And none of my work, I also just struggle with all those same questions of every writer, of self-doubt, and is this terrible? Is this good? Am I allowed to speak? And as a woman, as a writer of color, so I think of those things and bring that feeling of, trying to find ways to give ourselves permission to speak even. I think of the workshop as like a very sacred space in a way, and it's a place where, during the post-COVID, these kids coming out of quarantine, I felt incredibly, I think that's influenced my pedagogy as well, is realizing in that space, it was a place to connect to one another too. And I still feel that's a really great tool you learn in workshops, that no artist is on an island and that you need a community of other artists who you're working with and helping to create. So that's been effective too.
Right. I love that. And our final question before we have to go. What have you read recently that you would recommend to people who are watching today?
Yeah, I read a lot of nonfiction and I read a lot of fiction, and I want everyone to read Jonathan Escoffery's If I Survive You. And right now it's incredibly prescient and great to read in this sort of conversation around American identity and immigration and race. We need to protect art right now and support the arts, but also think about these questions. I also read, and I read this summer, now I'm teaching it. It's called The Coin by, I'm looking at the title, Yasmin Zahar, by a Palestinian American, I'm not sure if she's American, but she's Palestinian woman writer, and it's set in New York, and it's very funny and very smart. And I also, I was American Studies major, and I'm very interested in history, which informs all my fiction. And I'm reading a big book on Reconstruction right now by Eric Foner called The Second Founding. It's not a new book, but I'm trying to think about what is happening to this world and this country right now. And it's also informing my fiction, as history always does.
Well, I've enjoyed speaking with you. I hope our audience has enjoyed this hour, and everyone should run out and buy and read Colored Television if they have yet to. Even if they have, buy more copies, tell a friend, give it for gifts.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been such a pleasure. I'm so proud of your work and
Thank you.
I'm excited about your second book, and remember, by hook or by crook, a body of work.
Yes.
Protect.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.